Hand me the phone book. I'm Michael Smerconish in the Philly Burbs. The late, great William F. Buckley once said, "I would rather be governed by the first 2,000 people in the Manhattan phone book than the entire faculty of Harvard." I'm feeling the same way about Congress. It's day 4 of this government shutdown. More than 700,000 federal workers are being marginalized by the grandstanding of elected officials seeking to curry favor with their base. I know how we got here. Back in March, Democrats agreed to temporarily fund the government, but now, where a continuing resolution is needed to keep the government open, they're demanding Republicans make concessions regarding health care. Specifically, they want an extension of enhanced Obamacare subsidies that were part of the COVID stimulus package set to expire this year, and a reversal of Trump cuts to Medicaid and other health programs in a battle over which types of immigrants are eligible. My heart is with the Democrats. I like to joke that the Affordable Care Act, better known as Obamacare, is the worst system of supplying health care to Americans, except for all the alternatives. Socialism? Hardly. As first suggested by the Conservative Heritage Foundation, the ACA requires that everybody have health insurance, just like you need car insurance. And that includes the young invincibles, because with the buy-in of healthy Gen Zers, the overall insurance pool has this ability to insure those with pre-existing conditions. It makes sense. With everybody covered, the incentive exists for health insurers to participate in exchanges where customers can go, a la Amazon, and make purchases that are best for themselves and their families. I'm an independent contractor with both CNN and Sirius XM. This is how and where I get my health insurance. And there's nothing Mamdani about it. But while, like the Democrats, I'm protective of the ACA, their efforts to shut down the government violate my time and place rule. Because Republicans have advanced a clean continuing resolution. This is not the time and place to litigate health insurance policy. The objective should be to fund the obligations already made by the Congress. And if the result is catastrophic insurance losses and premium hikes for consumers, the solution should come in next year's midterm election. Meanwhile, 700,000 federal employees are being used as pawns. It's not fair to them and will only discourage others from seeking federal employment, as well as damage Americans' faith in the workings of their government. But let's not lose sight of how we got here. We aren't governed by some random sampling from the phone book. It's worse. We're governed by those who have a vested interest in a process that rewards extremism. Incendiary speech raises money, sound bites get you booked in the polarized media, and partisan voices have outsized influence over primary voters, especially in closed primary states. And that's the vicious cycle of our modern American politics. And no, it hasn't always been like this. Maybe you've heard the saying, the past is a foreign country. Our political past is more like a different planet. As I've often noted, as recently as the Reagan 80s, according to the National Journal, 60% of the House and Senate comprised of moderates. Back then, Reagan and Democratic House Speaker Tip O'Neill regularly clashed, but when it came down to it, these adversaries managed to make deals. As Tip O'Neill's son put it in the New York Times, "No, my father and Reagan weren't close friends." But famously, after 6 p.m., on quite a few work days, they would sit down for drinks at the White House. But it wasn't the drinks or the conversation that allowed American government to work. Instead, it was a stubborn refusal not to allow fundraisers, activists, party platforms, or ideological chasms to stand between them and actions, tempered and improved by compromise, that kept the country moving. Bismarck famously observed, "Politics is the art of the possible," but today there are very few adults left in the room. Because a kid might take his ball and go home, but adults are supposed to understand you can't get everything you want. The point of negotiation is not to utterly destroy the other side, but to reach an agreement you can live with, even though you feel you gave up something. And that's what's missing in Washington today. That's what Washington is supposed to do when operating properly. And it wasn't that long ago when we could expect at least some spirit of compromise. But gradually that spirit has eroded, and more recently both parties have shifted to the extremes, even since the last shutdown in 2018. As pointed out by Carl Hulse in the New York Times this week, deal makers who once ruled the landscape have gone the way of the dodo. Quote, "The Democrats from red states who decried the shutdown strategy as a foolish miscalculation and pressed for an immediate reversal in the showdown with President Trump 7 years ago are long gone. The ideological makeup of the party has shifted to the left, and Democrats are now bracing for an extended confrontation with the White House and congressional Republicans, despite the clear political risks. The same dynamic is at play in the GOP, which has lurched to the right under Mr. Trump and no longer sees room for compromise. There are very few exceptions, members who will act with civility and with independence. I think that Chris Coons is one. That's why I've invited him to be on today's program. It's important to note that the parties have changed, not the people. What Morris Fiorina, author of Unstable Majorities, calls party sorting. The electorate is pretty much the same as it was 50 years ago, but the two parties have become more ideologically uniform and further apart, fueled by the partisan media. Here are some milestones that I think illustrate what I'm describing. Go back to 1964. Southern Democrats, the Democrats, filibustered the Civil Rights Act for 57 days. 27 Republican senators joined the Northern Democrats to break it. Indeed, Republicans supported the Civil Rights Act, Republicans, in higher percentages than the Democrats. In 1972, environmentalists targeted the dirty dozen anti-environment members of Congress. 5 of them were Democrats, including the Interior Chair, who then lost his primary. In 1981, President Reagan's tax cuts passed with the help of 48 House Democrats. In the 1990s, gun control legislation was often blocked by Democrats, like John Dingell, a board member of the NRA. And then the century turned. Everybody suited up in their party uniform. 2001, President George W. Bush passed his tax cuts. Reagan had 48 Democrats. Bush had only 13. 2010, President Obama passed the Affordable Care Act with zero, a Blutarski, of Republican support. 2022, President Biden's Inflation Reduction Act followed suit, another straight party line vote. Not a single Republican joined Democrats on that bill to address climate change, health care, and taxes. And this year, when President Trump won passage of his big, beautiful bill, not a single Democrat was supportive. Reflecting on what William F. Buckley said, maybe it was a bad sign 10 to 20 years ago when they stopped giving out phone books. Because since then, the age of cross-party coalitions is over. And compromise is the new C word. Joining me now to talk about it is Democratic Senator Chris Coons of Delaware, who maybe right now is wondering why he accepted my invitation. Senator Coons, thank you for being here. You said on the eve of the shutdown, quote, "I'm usually one of the first to walk across the aisle and say, let's find a solution, let's find a way out of it. How come not this time?"
Well, Michael, thank you. Thanks for a chance to be on, and thank you for that thorough review of the history of partisanship and bipartisanship in recent years. I'm just going to start by reminding you that as recently as 2 and 3 years ago, we had a president who was signing into law the most significant bipartisan pieces of legislation in decades. So it's not as if bipartisan deal makers and the possibilities of bipartisanship have disappeared, but this most recent election has put in place a president and a majority who are utterly uninterested in it. I regularly interacted with President Trump and his White House in his first term. We haven't spoken once since the inauguration. I used to hear from his Legislative Affairs Office, from different cabinet members in his first term. Not once in this administration. And the point you just made, that the most important focus of the Trump legislative initiative this Congress was the so-called Big Beautiful Bill, and it passed without a single Democrat, is right. And what was the most important thing that bill did? It cut taxes for billionaires and profitable companies, the most profitable companies, and it ended access to health care for millions of Americans, which is starting to take effect at the end of this year and then 2 years later. Why pick a fight over health care right now? Because the costs are finally hitting home for millions of Americans. Here in Delaware, our insurance commissioner has made it clear that the Affordable Care Act exchange, the Obamacare exchange, those rates are going up 30%. And as you said earlier, if you push the healthy folks who can still afford to be a part of that health insurance pool out of coverage, it ends the Affordable Care Act. Trump's first term was largely about trying to repeal Obamacare. As I'm sure you remember, my friend John McCain ended that effort. Now they're trying to end access to affordable health care for millions through this method. What's the consequence? All of us will have more costly health insurance. All of us will face greater wait times in emergency rooms. And as of this week, all of us are facing higher costs for prescription medications because of Trump's tariffs. I don't like a shutdown. I don't think this is good for our country. I don't think it's good for our military. I don't think it's good for compromise. But we have to see some movement towards reversing these cuts. I understand that compromise means we won't get all of them. But when the Senate Republican majority agreed with Mike Johnson, Speaker Johnson from the House, and stepped back from appropriations negotiations, I said we've got to find a moment and leverage to get back to the table on reversing the disastrous cuts to NIH and the CDC, and working together to reverse these disastrous cuts to affordable health care for Americans.
Okay, quick reaction. I think the timeline doesn't support you insofar as you're a month off, meaning when open enrollment begins on November 1st, and now the rubber meets the road in the mailbox, people are going to wake up to what Senator Coons is saying. I don't think they're there yet, and I don't think you can keep the government shut down for an additional month. Second point is, if everything you're saying is accurate, and by the way, I believe in the accuracy of what you're saying, then Republicans will be due for a shellacking in the midterm election. What's wrong with that being the way to handle this?
So waiting until insurance rates are locked in and not changeable, and negotiating in November and December, and waiting until millions of Americans suffer the loss of health care, higher health care costs, longer wait times, isn't what Democrats do, because we want to fix the problem. On the floor of the Senate, talking to a group of Republicans and Democrats this week, one of them said, "Why are you guys trying to help us fix this problem if it's really such a big political win for you?" And I said, because we don't want the American people to suffer. You're absolutely right, Michael. The right thing to do from a narrow partisan political sense is to just fold our arms and say, you wait and see. When healthcare costs go through the roof, people are going to be mad. When rural hospitals close, people are going to be mad, and we'll benefit in the next election. But I don't want to wait until those hospitals close. I just met this week with the head of the Delaware Hospital Association. They're freaking out over the costs to health care for Delawareans, and I want us to have a focused conversation this week that will hopefully put us on a path towards negotiating a resolution.
Okay, I watched that video, and I recommend others do it as well in your social media. I'm hoping the government reopens and these issues get negotiated, because come November, I think people are going to recognize the strength of what you're saying. Thank you for being back here. I wish we had more time, Senator Coons. Joining me now to talk about this is David Wasserman, the senior editor and elections analyst for the Cook Political Report with Amy Walter. He's recognized as one of the nation's top election forecasters. David, it occurs to me there's a new definition of moderate these days in Washington.
Yeah, that's right. Look, 15 years ago in the Senate, there were 17 states with senators of different parties, which meant that they kind of had to work together to get things done for their states. Today, there are only 2 states that have split Senate delegations, Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. 15 years ago, there were 23 senators from parties that were opposite what the presidential candidate in their state won. And today, there are only 11 senators from parties won by presidential candidates of the opposite states. And so we've had this surge in straight voting in just the last couple of cycles that has led to a total polarization of not just the House, which is up every 2 years, but the Senate, which is up every 6 years. And in the House, it's even more dramatic. In the heading into the Obama first midterm, there were 83 members from congressional districts won by the opposite party's presidential candidate. Today, there are only 16 members, 13 Democrats and 3 Republicans from crossover districts who have any incentive to get together and get things done. So this shutdown is taking place during a very different set of political circumstances from previous ones.
And it's gotten a lot worse just in the last couple of years. If I mention the personalities, I think that sometimes that illustrates the point. Joe Manchin would be at the top of my list. Lamar Alexander would be on my list as well. I'll give you one from each side of the aisle. Just pointing to people who were like Coons, like Senator Coons, of the sort willing to get in a room and get it done. So my question to David Wasserman, knowing the complexion, the makeup of the House and Senate so well, is who can we look to now in the Senate as brokering this kind of a deal?
Well, I think we probably know how this shutdown ends. And the hint was 3 Democratic senators who broke ranks and voted to avert a shutdown. John Fetterman from Pennsylvania, Catherine Cortez Masto from Nevada, Angus King from Maine. And look, fundamentally, Democrats are a party that is inspired by some of their primary base, because I think it's absorbed a lot of previous moderates from the Republican Party to embrace pragmatism and keeping things open, whereas Republicans are a party that's more hostile to a functional federal government. Democrats want to see things stay open. And so I do think you'll see Democrats after a while fold and argue that they'll take their fight to the midterms. They do have a better chance of regaining some power, at least in the House, especially because the administration, President Trump, Russ Vought, they're just threatening mass layoffs of federal workers, but they're also targeting funding for projects in blue states. And at some point, I think Democrats are to try and claim a messaging victory that they were able to shift the focus nationally onto health care, and in particular, Medicaid cuts and the looming Obamacare cliff, which are potent issues for them next November.
David Wasserman, as always, we appreciate your expertise. Thank you for being here. What are your thoughts if you're at home? Hit me up on social media. Follow me on X. Subscribe to my YouTube channel. Of course, your heart is with the Dems. It usually is. Ho, ho, ho. Foster, I'm nuanced, okay? I'm not here to, do I have to say this every week? I'm not here to carry anybody's water. The Affordable Care Act, so maligned, and yet intuitively makes so much sense. Let's all get insurance. If we all have insurance, hey, we can take care of the people among us with pre-existing conditions. Here's a radical idea. Let's set up an exchange, and just as we all are akin to going on Amazon and buying a product, we can buy our health insurance there. When I did it, when the Affordable Care Act first rolled out, I had 26 different choices. They only came from a handful of carriers, but nevertheless, I could go through each one of them like I was buying a mini fridge and decide, oh, that's the product for me. And meanwhile, people are hoisting Gadsden flags. Don't tread on me. Really? Don't tread on you? Why? Because you want to show up in an ER without insurance and burden me? No. Everybody get insurance. Gen Z, they call it self-care and authenticity. Hiring managers call it a problem. Is this generation really unemployable or just misunderstood? Susie Welch has inspired today's poll question at Smerconish.com. We're going to get to it later in the program. Here it is. Will Gen Z, like previous generations, eventually find its footing? And decades before Donald Trump, blue-collar Democrats began to leave the party. The hard hat riot marked that shift, a milestone moment. Could history be repeating itself now, but with Hispanic voters? We'll ask the man who wrote the book on the subject.
And you take that flag and throw it on the floor and step on it. You just made it personal.
We are the second American Revolution. We are winning.
I approve of what you're doing because it's going to cause a revolution, but not your kind, my kind.
Richard Nixon will seize this moment and shift the Republican Party from blue bloods to blue collars. The hard hat riot is a microcosm of the polarization that will come to define American life.